Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, good evening, depending on where in the world you are joining us from. And a very, very warm welcome to this webinar. The webinar is hosted as part of Parks Week in conjunction with a few partners who I will mention in the following slides. And this is a Cities with Nature webinar on the benefits of access to nature for urban communities during and beyond pandemics and associated movement restrictions. So at this point, I just want to wish a very warm welcome to everyone and thank you for joining us. This webinar is brought to you by the World Parks Academy in association with World Urban Parks. And on that note, some webinar basics or some ground rules that we can run through. If you have a question, please feel free to make use of the chat box, noting that other users may be able to see your question, and I think there's a drop-down arrow that allows you to direct your question to a specific audience. And please, we ask that you mute yourself, your microphone, when you're not speaking to ensure the best quality of sound. Just to let everyone know that CEU points are available for participating today. And for any questions on this, you can email the World Parks Academy at the email address on your screen now. So just to get us started, I wanted to quickly introduce ICLEI. ICLEI is hosting this webinar in partnership with the World Urban Parks and the World Parks Academy. And on behalf of our global partnership initiative called Cities with Nature. So ICLEI is the leading global network of over 1,700 cities, towns, and regions who are all committed to building a sustainable urban future. It's through our dedicated Cities Biodiversity Center based in Cape Town, South Africa, where I am talking to you from today, that we support cities from around the world on mainstreaming biodiversity and nature-based solutions into urban planning and development at the local level. So just very quickly, a note from ICLEI and our Cities Biodiversity Center. We've had a multi-pronged approach to our response to COVID-19, but I think briefly our position can be articulated based in 4 key messages that I hope will set the tone for this webinar. And those are that building urban resilience is critical at this time, now more than ever before, and the pandemic is placing a huge strain on our healthcare systems, our communities, and our governments. And we stand in solidarity together as we build a resilient future. The second message is about the need to protect and respect nature, acknowledging that nature provides a diverse range of life-supporting and enhancing benefits. The third message is that nature is good for you. I'm sure we can all agree, and especially at this time where many of us have been separated from our parks or are in some form of lockdown. I'm sure that our longing for nature is stronger than ever, and we are realizing just how important it is to our daily lives. I can speak from personal experience that we are in complete lockdown here in South Africa. We have been for nearly 5 weeks now, and we have not been able to leave our houses. So for me, I've really been celebrating even just the plants in my apartment have kept me going in a sense. And the fourth message is that now more than ever, we are seeing an increasingly a move to virtual engagement and the need to connect online. And I think Cities with Nature is an example of a platform that allows us to all come together, engage and connect with each other, which is especially important at this time, all online. So just as we begin, Urban Parks, this webinar is presented as part of Parks Week, which is currently underway. And we really aim to highlight in this webinar the importance of urban parks and the role that they play in our urban lives, especially at this moment as we're seeing. So we're aiming to share some thoughts and ideas and experiences today on the role of these parks and in the role of nature and urban life. We want to explore some themes around bringing parks to people and connecting people with nature. To really, reflect on how much we appreciate these green spaces in our cities. and the role that nature is playing, especially in the future of our cities. So we have a really exciting panel, and the aim of today's session, and I hope to set a tone, one of informality and one of engagement that will really allow us to have a rich knowledge sharing session as we hear from some exciting speakers. So before I introduce them, I just want to introduce Cities with Nature, which provides a shared global platform for cities and all levels of subnational government to connect and to come together. Cities with Nature is a big tent partnership initiative. We work with a range of global partners, and the initiative was co-founded by ICLEI, the IUCN, and the Nature Conservancy. And we invite all cities, regardless of size, to join us on this journey and to connect with us on the Cities with Nature platform. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our 5 panelists today. And just to say that each of them is a representative from a city that is part of Cities with Nature. So we're really excited to bring you this webinar. I am your moderator. My name is Timothy Blatch. I'm a professional officer at ICLEI Africa, and specifically in ICLEI's Cities Biodiversity Center based in Cape Town. And I'm also the global coordinator for the Cities with Nature initiative. I'd like to introduce the panel in the order they will speak. So first we have Mr. Peter Massini, and he's the lead Green Infrastructure Development, Enterprise and Environment for the Greater London Authority. We also then have Mr. Mas Dojiri, and Mas is joining us from Los Angeles. He is the Assistant General Manager at the LA Sanitation and Environment, and is that department's Chief Scientist. I'd also like to introduce Joelle, and Joelle Lefrancois. She is the Planning Advisor for Urban Biodiversity in the Parks and Biodiversity Management Department in the City of Montreal. Then we have Mr. Errol Downs, who is Senior Manager of the Restoration Ecology Branch, Environmental Planning and Climate Change Protection Department in the City of Durban, or the eThekwini local municipality. And last but not least, we have Mr. David Callow, who's the Acting Director for Parks and City Greening in the City of Melbourne. So a warm welcome to all of our panelists. We are so thrilled to have you all with us, and thank you for joining us. We are honored for you to take the time to share some reflections and really to exchange and share knowledge around how our cities are responding to the pandemic from a nature point of view, and to also provide some reflections both from a city and personal point of view of the different contexts in which we find ourselves around the world as we try to co-build a common and collective future. So briefly, the agenda for today, I've covered the opening and welcome. We'll share some experiences from London, Los Angeles, Montreal, Durban, and Melbourne. Before, hopefully, if we have some time, we're going to have some concluding remarks from a guest who is hopefully on the line with us. And if there's time, we will open the floor for some questions and discussion. That's not to say you have to wait until then to ask a question. Please feel free to make use of the chat box, as we've said. But at that point, you will be able to unmute yourself and ask a question. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to our first panelist. And this is Mr. Peter Massini from the Greater London Authority. So Peter, thanks for joining us and thanks for being here. Peter has spent the majority of his 30-year career as an urban ecologist and green infrastructure policymaker. And for 10 years, he's been working on green infrastructure and the natural environment policy for the Greater London Authority. So Peter, thank you for joining us, and over to you.
Okay, thank you, Timothy, and hello to everyone from around the world listening into this webinar. It's quite a sort of strange unifying experience, because I think we're all probably locked up in our rooms in all different parts of the world. So a unifying experience, but a bit of an unsettling one too. So I hope everyone stays safe and well. I want to sort of touch on a number of issues in my short presentation, largely sort of reflecting on some of the sort of areas of policy and practice we begin to think about as a consequence of the current crisis. So go to the next slide, please, Timothy. So, as I guess in common with many other countries around the world, the lockdown hasn't been a complete lockdown in London. So people have been allowed out for exercise, and that's demonstrated the enormous value of our park system. And London's blessed to have a wide range of parks and open spaces. And we've also had unseasonably warm weather throughout April in the UK. So that's actually encouraged huge numbers of people to come out into our parks, which has created a number of problems in terms of social distancing, and the police and others have had to be involved to try and ensure that people keep a reasonable distance away from each other to help reduce the transmission of the virus. But I think one of the issues that's thrown up is that the people using the parks tend to be people who live close to the parks, but also people who are young, active, out wanting to take exercise and recreation, young families with children. Next slide, please, Timothy. And perhaps the area we haven't explored properly yet, and will have implications for future policy, is huge numbers of people, more vulnerable groups, elderly people, single parents with young children living in tower blocks and in estates who don't have easy access to parks and green spaces. We know this is a problem already in London, that quite a number of people don't have easy access to parks and green spaces. And it's something we've already been beginning to consider how we address that through policy and practice. But the coronavirus crisis has really put a spotlight on that as a really significant issue of social justice going forward. Next slide, please. So the issues we've been trying to grapple with now is about how we ensure that, in addition to maintaining that parks network, and how we manage and maintain and fund parks in the future, bearing in mind there might be quite a severe economic shock as a result of the coronavirus. How do we actually create the opportunities for people who can't currently access parks to have the same, or not the same, but similar experiences of nature, of access to outdoors, access to fresh air, experiencing some of the delights of parks, but not within the sort of conventional park network. And so in London already, we've been thinking about these issues in terms of how we create a more integrated network of green spaces and how we green the urban environment. And it seems to me that that area needs to be a real focus as we recover from the pandemic and move forward in terms of urban greening policy. So some of that will be thinking about how we actually ensure that the connections between those spaces are far better than they are now. Many parks are isolated by roads, by traffic, which deters some people from using them. If we can actually create much better connected spaces through transport, walking and cycling infrastructure, that gives people the opportunity to access a much wider part of the network. It's quite controversial. There's been lots of pushback about integrating cycling infrastructure with our park network, because many current park users believe parks are something apart from the city, something separate from the hustle and bustle of the city. But I think if we're going to make that transition and make parks and green spaces more accessible to more people, we have to think about how that walking and cycling infrastructure is properly and fully integrated into the parks network. Next slide, please. And it's also about thinking about how we integrate accessible green space into our built environment. Even before the corona crisis, we knew that London was becoming a denser city, a more developed city, and there will be a premium on the existing parks and open spaces. So we already knew we had to think about how we create green experiences within the built environment. And many of the policies we have in place already achieve that in terms of putting in things like green walls and green roofs. But again, this lack of access to parks by the most vulnerable groups to the most disadvantaged groups, making us think even more about the possibility of publicly accessible green spaces on roofs, on podiums, rather than just thinking about those green roofs as places for wildlife or places for managing stormwater runoff. Can we actually create extensive areas of public open space on buildings? If you think about the young mother on the 10th floor of a tower block with a young child, even if they got a park close by to them, in the current circumstances, they cannot get to those parks because they can't socially distance in the lift, for example. So can you actually make access to podium space, to roof space, which provides that alternative contact with nature, alternative public space, literally within or adjacent to or on top of the buildings you live in? So we'd already gone down this route to some extent in terms of broad urban greening, but the corona crisis really puts a spotlight on how we make that space publicly accessible. Next slide, please. And we're fortunate. Now, we've been discussing about whether we need new policies, new approaches. We certainly need new approaches and new practice, but we've actually got an existing policy framework that was certainly heading in this direction. A policy framework that was largely driven by issues around resilience, climate resilience, and driving down carbon emissions. So in the Mayor's Transport Strategy, which was published a couple of years ago, a big emphasis on how we reimagine, rethink the street network in London to make much more space available for walking and cycling. And again, the coronavirus, with the whole issue around social distancing, has really brought into sharp focus the need to make much more of the public realm accessible for walking and cycling for a whole range of different groups who can't access the existing parks network. Next slide, please. And the new London plan, which is about to be published, again, had already shifted from a policy framework which is focused on protecting the core network of parks and green spaces, which is an essential requirement, to thinking about how we accelerate the greening of the urban environment. Again, that was driven largely by a climate resilience agenda, but I think the coronavirus has now demonstrated that this is a social justice agenda as well. I think final slide now. Yep, so that's me done. So just some reflections on how our existing policy framework perhaps needs to be not reconfigured, but a shift in focus to address a social justice agenda as much as it does a climate change agenda. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Peter, and thanks for sharing the experiences of London. I think I was particularly interested around, around what you spoke about, these connections between the parks and bringing the public realm into greater focus, especially around mobility and access as well. So that was very interesting to hear. Yeah, so thank you for sharing. Again, we are so grateful to have you with us today. I'm mindful of time, so we must move on, and I'd like to introduce our next panelist, Dr. Dojiri from the City of Los Angeles, and he's currently the Assistant General Manager in the Sanitation and Environment Department, and also the Chief Scientist, and he oversees the Technical Services Division, and Mas is the Executive in charge of the Biodiversity Program, the Los Angeles River Watershed Monitoring Program, as well as the Environmental Justice Program. So Mas, thank you for joining us, and thanks for being here and I know that you have important work to do, so thank you for taking the time, and I'll hand over to you now. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Timothy, and I welcome everybody who's on the virtual meeting or symposium. As Timothy mentioned, I am the Assistant General Manager and Chief Scientist of LA Sanitation and Environment. And I really want to thank you for inviting me as a speaker to talk about the city of Los Angeles perspective on the pandemic and the access to open spaces, beaches, hiking trails, etc. Next slide, please. On March 19th, 2020, the mayor of Los Angeles identified outdoor activities as one of the essential activities, along with shopping for food and medical supplies and providing or receiving care. So obviously he thought that the outdoor activities, being out in the open, was really beneficial for not just the mindset of Angelenos, but also the physical aspect of it because of the cardiovascular exercise, etc. Next slide. Unfortunately, unfortunately, the Angelenos started packing the beaches, trails, and parks in a very unsafe manner. The density was so high at these public areas, recreational areas, that people couldn't really practice the social distancing recommendations and requirements. And so on March 22nd, which is only 3 days later, the mayor, Mayor Eric Garcetti of the city of Los Angeles, closed the public beaches, trails, and many parks. Next slide. So what did we do with those recreation and park facilities? There are actually, what we did was we added 6,000 shelter beds for homeless Angelenos in hopes of slowing the virus spread. The big concern was that the homeless population, which is a little over 36,000 people, that number was obtained from 2019. These homeless people in the city of LA, the fear was that if the coronavirus hit the homeless population, it would spread very quickly because of the density, because of their lack of education on the coronavirus, and because of the lack of hygiene stations, you know, their inability to take showers, wash hands, etc. And so we converted 42 LA parks into temporary emergency shelters and for the homeless and to function as quarantine areas. The problem was that when the city of LA closed all those beaches, hiking trails, and open spaces, then people ended up driving to areas where this neighboring cities, communities had not yet closed those areas. One of the things that showed us was how important these recreational areas are to the residents of the city of LA. So that was a piece of information that was very important that we gleaned from this. Next slide, please. So what has the pandemic really taught us? You know, if you're going to get anything good out of the pandemic, it's lessons learned. And one of the things that we learned was that the quality and the environment actually improved. It improved the air and water quality significantly, and also the traffic. That's one thing that I don't have on this slide. One of the famous freeways in the city of LA is called the 405 freeway. And every day it is jam-packed. And during the rush hour, if there is such a thing anymore, it's essentially a parking lot. And we're talking about like 6 lanes in each direction. I mean, it's a huge freeway. And you see pictures, overhead pictures now, and it's essentially empty. It's like a ghost town or ghost road. And so the city is now considering telecommuting beyond the pandemic. I'm an assistant general manager in a department that has about 3,400 staff, and about 800 to 900 staff are actually telecommuting. So the traffic has been essentially zero on the freeways, and the air quality has improved significantly, so that if you see a picture before and after the pandemic, it's really significant. The before, it's like a haze over the downtown portion of the city of LA. because of the smog, the air pollution. And you look at after or during the pandemic, and you can, it's crystal clear skies. It's amazing. Another point that the pandemic has showed us is that the open space is really inadequate in the urban environment. And when we take a look at open space access, we should really assess it from both an environmental justice perspective as well as a native wildlife standpoint. A pandemic like pollution and climate change has disproportionate impacts on disadvantaged communities. These are low-income urban communities, and we want to make sure that that they're protected and that their health is certainly protected. Next slide, please. We have found that access to nature is really important to the public, but that access will produce adverse impacts on the native fauna. We know this because we see in the absence of people going to the open areas, that there's increased wildlife. Can someone put, who's talking, be put on mute, please? And in the urban environment, we have photographs in the newspapers showing wildlife walking down the middle of the street. It's really amazing. So it really indicates to us that we have an adverse impact on the native fauna. And so we need to be mindful of that and incorporate that into our biodiversity approaches. And the last point I want to make is that we need a science-based approach when we take a look at public health or biodiversity or other environmental issues. The guidance from science and scientists is crucial. We can't make our decisions based on gut level feelings and hunches, and that we need to be prepared. We can't have a knee-jerk reaction after the event occurs. We have to be prepared in advance and be proactive on public health issues, on biodiversity issues, and other environmental issues. So those are the lessons that we learned from this pandemic. I think that's the last slide, Timothy.
Great, thank you so much, Mas, and thank you for taking the time to join us today and to share some of these valuable experiences. I particularly like what you said about, you know, the before and after. And, you know, we talk about after, but we're actually meaning that in the pandemic. And I think this is really thought-provoking in terms of which one of those two realities we sort of want to see into the longer-term future. So I think that it's causing us to fundamentally rethink that, and in terms of, you know, the way in which we interact with nature in our cities. So thank you for sharing. And thank you for being with us. I really enjoyed, you know, the case studies and examples of your parks being converted into spaces for the homeless. It's really great to see that. I think it's, you know, it also maybe will contrast a few of the other examples we see later. But thank you for joining us, and thank you for sharing your reflections and perspectives.
Thank you.
So next up,
Thank you.
Pleasure. Next up, we have Joelle Lefrancois, and Joelle is with the City of Montreal, where she's been working for nearly 15 years on the topic of biodiversity in the urban context, and she works as a planning advisor, and her main projects relate to local and international expertise and exchange networks, ecosystem services and social perceptions, and the popularization of various biodiversity issues to inform citizens. Joelle, it's wonderful to have you with us, and thank you for joining, and over to you.
Thank you, Tim, for this introduction. So hello, everyone. I will present to you a brief overview of the current situation in Montreal parks and a few perspectives on ecosystem services in the context of the pandemic. Next slide, please. So real quickly, let me start by showing you this map of the agglomeration of Montreal. Montreal is located in Canada, in the province of Quebec, and it covers an area of about 500 square kilometers and is home to approximately 2 million people. Next slide, please. In Montreal, there are over 20 large parks. All of them have their own particular charms, landscapes, and ecosystems, and they are generally very rich in biodiversity. And we also have over 1,400 smaller parks with green areas and playing grounds that we call local parks, which are distributed in neighborhoods all over the territory. Next slide, please. In the context of the pandemic, the decision in Montreal to this day is to keep the parks open, but with certain restrictions to protect public health. For example, gatherings are prohibited and certain areas are closed, like the playing modules are closed, the reception centers are also closed, and people are encouraged to stay in their neighborhood and visit the park that is closest to their place of residence to limit movement throughout the city. Next slide, please. Before the pandemic, people were used to gather in parks to relax, to enjoy the sunlight, to play, to celebrate birthdays, to practice activities, and so on. Parks make a really important contribution to the collectivity on a social level. So social distancing in parks is understandably a big change for people, especially at a time when several are restless, they're tired of being inside the house. At the beginning of the pandemic in Mount Royal Park, which is an important park in Montreal, groups of joggers were training by running up and down the famous stairs of the mountain that we call the Big Stairway, while other visitors were walking up and down slowly, and the cohabitation was difficult. Visitors were worried the stairs are not wide enough to accommodate for both uses, while at the same time allowing people to follow social distancing instructions. So the Big Stairway was closed, and there were also some gatherings. So police presence was increased in a few very popular parks to remind people of social distancing instructions, which are being followed by the majority of the population. Next slide, please. The social benefits of parks are not as accessible at the moment, unfortunately, and it is a big change, as mentioned, but there are other park benefits related to health, physical, psychological, and cognitive health that can be brought to light for citizens who might be feeling down and a little discouraged by the restrictions. Visiting a park alone allows for an immersion in nature and for contemplation. It may be easier to feel that connection with nature when we are alone, or accompanied by a spouse, for example, and we stay silent. We can hear the sound of the leaves and the wind. We can see the spring flowers emerging, smell the soil, the forest soil, and listen to the birds sing. Bird activity being very high in Montreal at this time of year. And all these things we may not be able to notice when we visit parks in larger groups. And of course, studies have shown that seeing and being surrounded by nature contributes to lowering stress, reducing mental fatigue, improving overall well-being, which are all important benefits at this time. Next slide, please. And encouraging people to visit the park that is closest to their residence, a park that they may not have noticed before in their daily surroundings. It can also allow families to make great discoveries, learning about local ecology, observing plant, insects, small mammals, and birds. It will sound like a play on words, but maybe some seeds will be planted for the future as well, because maybe some young people will aspire to become biologists or to contribute to environmental protection actions in their community because of that connection. And playing outside at a walkable distance from home can also bring important benefits and encourage active transportation now, but also in the future. Next slide, please. Another ecosystem service that is of interest in the current context is the inspiration, either philosophical or artistic, that can be associated with being with nature. These activities are all compatible with social distancing and can also be very beneficial to health, to well-being, but also to self-development and to contribute to the culture. Next slide, please. So nature is a system, it's a web of life where everything is connected. And we know that nature is important for human physical and mental health. maintaining a possibility for people to connect with nature somehow appears to be quite important in a time of confinement in the city. There are restrictions to our lifestyles, but perhaps bringing to light the ecosystem services that people can benefit from right now and the actions that they can do, it could be a welcome positive message. And perhaps all our observation of nature, our discoveries, our nature-inspired works of art, perhaps sharing them and discussing them with family, friends, or even a community of peers online, maybe that could be one of the ways to keep those connections to nature and to people, that social contribution in this difficult social distancing context. So I'll leave you with that thought. Thank you for your attention.
Great, thank you so much, Joelle, and thank you for being with us today. Thanks for sharing the experience of Montreal. I was just reflecting while you were talking on how amazing it is that we can gather like this virtually. And I feel like we're doing a little bit of a tour of the world, if you will, you know, where we're getting to hear and see amazing examples. And I particularly like the way in which, you know, the different speakers are coming with a slightly different approach, you know, where Marce's approach was maybe, yeah, he spoke about the very sort of science base, and where yours, you know, was provoking a lot around visiting a park by yourself and really what is it you can notice and draw inspiration from. So that's really amazing. And I think it's also critical to sort of differentiate between the social benefits and the individual benefits. That was something personally I had never really thought about until you presented now. You know, how the parks usually have such a social element to the way in which people use them. And now it's more about that personal, individual reflection and inspiration. So thank you for being with us and for sharing. I'm really excited to introduce Mr. Errol Dowes from the city of Durban, and returning to a bit of an African context here, closer to home for me. And as I've said, Errol's based in Durban, South Africa, where he works for the local government authority and manages the municipality's restoration ecology function. Errol works on a very wide range of projects, yeah, Errol, we are so lucky to have you with us, and thank you for joining. It's an honor, and I'm really looking forward to hearing this South African perspective on this. So without further ado, over to you. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Timothy, and thanks for inviting me, and good evening from Durban to all the listeners. Yeah, we're under complete lockdown here in Durban, except for the essential services like going out for shopping, etc. Yeah, I'll be chatting a little bit about the role of nature in our city, both from a planning perspective, but also in terms of the current situation and some of the broader considerations at the current time. So I'm not sure where my slides are, but I'll keep talking. So first of all, I'll tell you a little bit about Durban. So we're a fairly large municipality here in South Africa. We've got an area of about 24,000 square kilometers, about 4 million people in the area. And we've got quite a steep gradient from sort of down at the city, which is at sea level, right up to about 1,000 meters above sea level, and many ecosystems in between that gradient. So some of the ecosystems include, for example, grasslands down near the coast, but also inland. Other ecosystems included forests. We've got plenty of savanna, riverine thickets, wetlands, floodplains, and a range of other sort of smaller niche ecosystems. This picture is of our Kranskloof Nature Reserve. It shows some of the steep gradients in some of our areas with deeply incised rivers. We've got about 16 estuaries, and our municipality falls into what's known as one of the global biodiversity hotspots, the Maputoland, Pondoland, Albany hotspot. So this picture depicts a sort of a fractal which mimics what makes up our urban landscape of waterways and natural areas. And the municipality is effectively using a systematic conservation planning approach for the past 15 years to help make sense of this fractal system and to help us manage these open spaces more effectively. It's critical that we try and look after our biodiversity ecosystems, but also integrate that into the business, industry, and agriculture, which is obviously happening in the city. So core to all of this work is the establishment and maintenance of some of our parks, gardens, and nature reserves. And it's critical for people to get out and enjoy nature. Some of the activities, obviously we've got a diverse spectrum of use, like most of the other cities, would include people visiting a park to walk their dogs, picnics, games, many sports activities. And we're also fortunate enough to be on the Indian Ocean. It's a major tourist attraction here and a big money spinner for Durban. The beach is obviously used for surfing, swimming, and sunbathing, but also for cultural and spiritual purposes. Importantly for parks and gardens, it's also important for people to interact with nature. And this picture shows one of the viewing parks where residents can go and watch some of the 3 million barn swallows that come down to roost in the evening at one of our wetlands. It's also great having open spaces where people can walk out and enjoy some of our natural grasslands. Wildflowers are really important, as well as other biodiversity. From a planning perspective, it's obviously critical to think about genetic diversity, and our open spaces allow for gene flow through our natural areas. And of course, this is a really important consideration for us being here in a global biodiversity hotspot. We consider biodiversity to underpin and the maintenance of many of our ecosystems, but we do need careful management in some areas. For example, a lot of our grasslands need frequent burning for orchids like this little flower to flower on a regular basis. We also have a plan for management of protected species, but these often also require additional resources and technology, as well as additional policing and conservation measures to ensure that we can protect some of these areas. Some of our parks also have larger wildlife, which obviously is fantastic for photography and for bringing people both locally as well as from further afield. It also allows the public to experience wilderness, and of course these sort of interactions are really important from a spiritual perspective. Our ecosystems also provide really important ecosystem services which are essential for human survival, which include pollination, soil formation, and flood control. But importantly for Durban, water is one of our most important resources. And our open spaces are really critical for protection of our waterways, both for cleansing water, but also for increasing water flows to local communities. We have a number of dams in our area, and this helps to minimize water scarcity during dry times. But the dams can impact on biodiversity in our freshwater ecosystems, and that's something that as a planning function in the city, we do try and look at, and we do try and ensure that we minimize those damages. Rooftop gardens are one of the ways that the municipality is investigating the use of inner city rooftops. A great opportunity for city dwellers to learn about gardening, not only for food security, but also about biodiversity. And I think, as mentioned, these gardens can obviously reduce the heat island effect, reduce water runoff, etc. But these could be essential in times of lockdown or in pandemics if we need to start growing more food in the inner city. Of course, in our more rural areas, we've got some of the poorer communities growing a lot of trees, and we're also helping them to try and grow more food and fruit trees in their areas. Our oceans are, of course, another critical ecosystem for food supply, but we're also working to look at how climate change might impact our sea level and what damage that could cause on the city. But in times of disease, I think what was mentioned previously, stress is a really major risk where this has been shown in the current pandemic. And so we know that communities need open access to our open spaces, you know, as a means to reduce stress. And having access to not only our natural grasslands and forests, but also our ocean is really critical for spiritual growth and to reduce stress. And really for us, our healthy ocean means healthy livelihoods. And lastly, I think just to say, you know, the protection of biodiversity can also be for biodiversity's sake. And what's been really great is recent sort of citizen science apps such as iNaturalist online are helping people to reconnect with nature and to upload some of their photographs and learn about the biodiversity in our diverse city. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you, Errol. I think that was definitely a very inspiring presentation. It was almost like a tour of Durban. Those photographs are beautiful. And I think everyone online, this is a call when we are able to travel, come and visit us in South Africa and experience our amazing biodiversity and ecosystems. Before we move to our final speaker, I actually am going to take the liberty as moderator to ask you a question, Errol. You mentioned in the beginning of your presentation that you know, here in South Africa, we're pretty much in complete lockdown. So many of the ecosystems and the sort of natural areas or opportunities you showed here, what is the level of access like at this current moment?
Yeah, the level of access at the moment is very limited. You know, unless people have easy access to their gardens, or, you know, our municipality does extend to many sort of peri-urban and rural areas. So obviously those people have broader access to, you know, natural areas in and around their communities. Many of our communities have goats or cattle, and they would clearly have access to those areas. But for people living in the city, it's very much a lockdown, and yeah, the police are keeping a check that people are not sort of out jogging or walking their dogs or visiting parks at the moment.
Great, that's quite something to share, and I think that contrasts quite a bit with the experience of the other cities we've heard from so far. And I think it really shines a spotlight on the different experiences of urban communities at this time. Certainly, you know, here in South Africa, we are unable to access a lot of these areas. And as I mentioned, you know, this is where just my plants in my apartment, for example, become very important. So Errol, thanks so much for being with us and for sharing these amazing images and your story from Durban. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our final speaker, last but certainly not least, and Mr. David Callow is joining us from the city of Melbourne, and he's the acting director for Parks and City Greening, and he leads that division. The branch was created in 2019 to plan and innovate and protect and enhance Melbourne's iconic parks. So David, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Right, thank you, Timothy. And thanks for the opportunity to share in this webinar and to talk about what's happening in Melbourne. Apologies to the attendees, I don't have slides today. I'm going to be relatively brief and cover 3 items in my presentation. The first is to talk about the current situation in Melbourne and what the lockdown looks like for us and the role of parks in that lockdown. Secondly, I'll talk about adaptation and how we're continuing to deliver towards our goal of being a city with nature. And then finally, I want to talk about recovery and how we're planning for the future at the moment. So what's the situation in Melbourne? It's quite similar to some of the other cities as described. We're on what's being termed stage 3 restrictions. So you're required to stay at home unless you're out for work or other essentials, or if you're exercising, and that's kind of the key in terms of the interaction with parks. The other thing to note about Melbourne and Victoria, the state of Victoria more broadly, is that nearly all school-aged children are required to stay at home. So you have people working from home, and you also have most school-aged kids at home. And so that's creating quite the pressure cooker situation in many households. I can attest to that personally. So more than ever, access to open space in parks is important. It's important for families, it's important for individuals, it's important to allow people to get out and about and to exercise. And we've seen that play out. The exercise exemption has really significantly increased the use of parks, and that's particularly running, cycling, and people walking in those parks. And they've really become a critical resource for the health and well-being of people who live in the city, and particularly those, as others have mentioned, who might live in an apartment and have limited access to open space or within their own property. Interestingly, the exemption allows people to be out and to exercise, but it doesn't allow them to dwell within spaces. And so that means that while people can be busy, really they don't have the opportunity to have those social or restful interactions within the natural world. It's also requiring us in parks to actively manage these spaces to ensure that people aren't picnicking, they aren't hanging out in a social sense, and that's been quite a challenge for us. On that front, we've found that social media has been quite an effective tool in getting messaging out to people. That's in conjunction with other resources and signage and so forth. So during this time, my second point is really how are we continuing to grow and build a city with nature into the future. So under the strategy that we have at the City of Melbourne, the Nature in the City strategy, there's really two key deliverables. One of them is related to capital works, and that's about increasing biodiversity in the city through increased habitat. And the second action is about connecting people to nature. And under the current restrictions, we can really continue to deliver on the first outcome there, which is around capital works and increasing biodiversity. And that's through a number of programs, including tree planting, habitat restoration, and so forth. One of the challenges we have in adaptation is how do you continue to manage programs around connection to nature? And these are around citizen science, they're around our Gardens for Wildlife program and so forth. How do you manage these programs where they rely on social interactions and people sharing knowledge? An example I wanted to use today is around our Gardens for Wildlife program. And this is a community-led program that's facilitated by the city, where volunteers go into the properties, to the gardens of other people, and they provide advice about how they might improve the biodiversity outcomes within private property. And one of the critical aspects of this program is that the physical garden visits take place. And so what we've found is that whilst there's increased interest at this time around gardening and particularly around wildlife gardening, we've had to pivot in that program and to actually do virtual inspections of gardens and to provide advice through that sense, through that means. One of the other outcomes that we didn't expect is that the participants of that program, the volunteers who spend time visiting other people's gardens, we've seen increased participation in the volunteer meetings because people are able to, it's more accessible with the online meetings now that we're running. So that program is still running. We've had to pivot into a virtual sense, and that's had some positive and some negatives, but we see that as a critical thing to continue to operate at this time. So what about recovery after COVID-19? And so there's a number of initiatives that we've identified, as with others, that will accelerate in this time as we move towards recovery. One is around connection to nature and facilitating and strengthening those existing social connections. Secondly, we're really looking at ways that we might position the city to be able to take up the expected stimulus funds that as they become available. And that's particularly around the capital space. And we've got a proposal at the moment to implement a whole bunch of new habitat planting across the city that would employ currently unemployed people and also improve ecological connectivity. And then finally, it's really about reimagining the city that we might want in the future. So we had this global tragedy, but there will be opportunities and to make the most of the crisis and to really look at the key changes we might be able to make, whether that's around the way the streets operate, around cycling infrastructure, and around innovative forms of greening that we might be able to implement to increase people's access to nature. So the question is really, the challenge can we grab those opportunities at this time and make the most of this opportunity? That's all from me. Thanks, Timothy.
Great, thank you so much, David. And I think it's amazing to have a perspective from Melbourne. I think you've rightfully brought in, the point about it's not just up to the city. It's around, each of us have a role to play, and even private landowners. So it's great to hear what the city is doing. I think it's wonderful to have heard from all 5 of our representatives and panel today. And we are very proud to have them all as founding pioneer cities on our Cities with Nature platform. At this point, I know I'm conscious that we are running out of time, but I'd like to hand over if Jayne is on the call with us. And Jayne is the chair of the World Urban Parks, who we have recently very excitingly signed a partnership agreement with, and they're our newest partner as we go into Parks Week this year, and our newest partner on Cities with Nature as well. So Jayne, some concluding remarks from you. We're thrilled to have you with us today, and over to you.
All of the panelists today, Peter, Mas, David, Carol, and Joelle. Really thrilled to have all of
Sorry,
you.
Jayne. I think your sound is very, very soft. I don't know if it's only me, but.
Okay. I will make sure I turn it up. Is this better, Timothy?
No, it's very, very low.
How's this?
That's much better.
All right, sounds good. Sorry about that. But again, I want to thank Timothy for moderating this session, and thank Peter, Mas, Joelle, Carol, and Dave for being part of this and bringing us around the world, actually, in your presentation. So thank you. What I want to just briefly, I know we're running out of time, is provide some brief thoughts based on what many of the presenters shared today about how we move forward as cities. Clearly, social justice and equal access to parks has been an issue in the US, but it has become really clear through this pandemic and the issues that we've had that needing to ensure equal access, not just to parks, but to quality parks and quality open space is really, really critical, and driving that even further. And with that, ensuring that parks are integrated into cities, that they are not standalones, but having access to nature and parks, and ensuring the infrastructure to provide that is really important. And that we also think about how we build our built environment, integrating green space into the built environment, so that no matter where someone lives, that they have equal access to quality parks and open space. All of you talked about the critical diversity of your parks and your open spaces and green spaces that are true around the world, that is our common thread we all have. So how do we ensure that we maintain that diversity of these spaces, that we protect the biodiversity of wildlife and fauna in that, while also connecting people to nature, I think is really, really critical, and a new area that we need to think about as parks professionals. We also need to think about the fact that what happened in LA could potentially, and is happening in other cities, that as beaches and parks are being closed in one city, that it's forcing residents to go to other cities because there isn't that green space. The fact that we don't have adequate green space and access to it. So as we think about our recovery and coming out of this, how do we ensure and have better practices about retaining the biodiversity of our cities? How do we ensure that the environmental impacts, benefits that have improved since we've all been on social distancing and lockdown, that water quality, air quality improvements that have been occurring continue? How do we think about making sure that we're prepared, not reacting in the future to these pandemics or critical issues that might happen? So I think many of the things that we as professionals have been dealing with and have been talking about for a number of years, the criticalness and some of the nuances that we need to deal with, this pandemic has actually brought those to the forefront, to think differently about biodiversity, protecting it, protecting the flora, the fauna, the wildlife, yet making sure that we also continue to provide access equitably in every city in which we work in and live in. So thank you for the opportunity to provide some closing remarks. As the chair of World Urban Parks, I also want to promote, we have a number of other webinars going on the rest of this week. We have one this afternoon. If you go to the World Urban Parks website, you can see all of the webinars and register for them. We have one this afternoon, and then we have our final one tomorrow afternoon as well. So Timothy, I'll turn it back to you, and thank you again.
Great, thank you so much, Jayne, and thank you for providing some remarks. I concur with everything you've said and how important the recovery will be. I just want to, I know we have run out of time. I just want the opportunity, if there's any one burning question that anyone would like to ask a panelist or Jayne, or I just want to give a few seconds if there is anyone. But I see that most people have been using, there's been quite a great conversation in the chat box, which is wonderful to see. And I don't see any hands going up. So I think with that, in conclusion, I'd like to just thank World Urban Parks and the World Parks Academy for the opportunity to co-host this webinar and really to be a partner and be part of this very important Parks Week, where the theme is #NatureNeverCloses. And I want to take this opportunity as well to also encourage us to stay connected. And Cities with Nature, I encourage anyone on the call to check it out. It's a first of its kind initiative that's really allowing us to all stay connected as a global urban nature community. So with that, I really just want to thank all of our panelists. Thank you for joining us and for taking the time. It's been incredibly enlightening for me, and I hope for everyone else on the call. I think it's really amazing as I reflect just how we can do a tour of the world like this virtually. So to everyone who's joined us as well, thank you for being part of this webinar and for participating. And we look forward to being in touch soon. Our contact details are on the screen for the ICLEI Cities Biodiversity Center and for Cities with Nature. And we encourage everyone to join us and as we unite and really engage in this Parks Week that's currently running. So with that, I will conclude the webinar, and I also just want to thank the technical support we've had from the Parks Academy. They've been helping us technically in the background, no one knows, but just a huge thank you to everyone. And it's wonderful for us to all be able to gather like this. So until the next time, I hope everyone has a really great rest of the week and weekend. So with that, I will close, and thank you, everyone.